My own son called me a burden, right in front of everyone. But what he didn't know was that I still had one last card up my sleeve, and one day, he would learn what it feels like to be treated like a stranger. Before I continue this story, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button, because every time you engage, we prove to the world that dignity has no age and no price. That night is burned into my memory like a scar that never fades. It was a cold evening, December 2019. The wind outside whistled through the cracks in the windows, but inside Andrew's house it was another world. Golden lights reflecting on crystal glasses, loud laughter echoing across the room, expensive perfumes mixing with the smell of red wine. I sat quietly in an armchair to the side. My worn-out coat clashed with the designer suits around me. I didn't talk much, I just observed. Andrew, my son, moved through the room like the perfect host, tie perfectly in, place, rehearsed smile, a glass always in hand. At his side, Victoria, his wife, wore a red dress that looked straight out of a Fifth Avenue display. She smiled, but her eyes were cold, calculating, always weighing who deserved attention and who didn't. The guests laughed, toasted, and then one of them, a lawyer friend of the family, said casually, "Andrew, you're a lucky man. That business sense, that talent for building wealth, you must have gotten it from your father, right?" In that instant, the room went silent. It was like someone had cut off the music. Every eye turned toward me. I took a deep breath, straightened my coat, ready to hear at least a word of recognition, a gesture of gratitude, just a simple nod. But Andrew laughed, not a laugh of pride, a sharp, mocking laugh. He shook his head and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "My father, he never understood any of this. I built everything on my own. Honestly, these days he's just a burden I have to carry." Words hung in the air, heavier than silence. Rebecca covered her mouth, letting out a muffled laugh. Some guests looked away, embarrassed. Others nodded, as if agreeing. My face burned, my hands trembled. A burden. That's what my own son called me. Right there, in the middle of a crowded room. As if I were nothing more than dead weight he hadn't yet shaken off. The knot in my throat stopped me from speaking. But inside me, something sparked to life, because no one there knew that every wall of that house had been raised by my hands, that every brick, every wooden beam, every drop of sweat was part of my story. And, ironically, it was inside that very house that my son tried to erase me. I could have stood up and shouted. I could have shown the scars on my hands, reminded them all that the roof above their heads existed because of me. But I didn't. I stayed silent. And that silence was my loudest answer. Because in that moment, I already knew. One day, he would feel what it's like to be treated like a stranger. And that day was closer than he imagined. That night was just the spark. To understand the weight of that phrase, "My father is just a burden," you need to know the setting. My name is Richard Collins. I was 63 years old back then, a retired carpenter, rough hands covered in calluses, fingers scarred with stories no one wanted to hear. I was never a man of luxury. I was content with the basics. Strong coffee in the morning, the smell of freshly cut wood, the quiet, pride of watching a house take shape in front of me. My world was simple. Andrew's was not. He was born in 1983, a bright boy, always with a clean uniform and a brand new notebook, because I made sure he had what I never did. While I spent my days sawing boards and raising walls, Andrew studied at good schools. I used to tell myself, he won't have to get covered in dust like me. He'll be someone greater. And he was. So great, in fact, that he started looking down and stopped recognizing me at all. Andrew grew up, went to college, entered the financial world, and climbed quickly. Ambitious, determined, armed with catchy lines he picked up from business books. He became a manager at one of the biggest banks in the city, and with him came Victoria. Victoria was stunning. No one could deny that. Tall, flawless posture, outfits chosen to impress. But behind that polite smile, there was constant judgment. I saw it in her eyes. Every time she looked at my worn coat or my scuffed boots, her brow furrowed as if to say, "This is the father you have, Andrew?" They lived in a big, imposing house in the upscale part of town, a house I knew better than anyone. Not just because I'd seen the blueprints, but because I was the one who built the first walls years before, when I still dreamed that place would be the home of a united family. Ironically, that house became a stage, a theater of appearances, where every dinner was a performance of status. Imported crystal glasses, silver cutlery, bottles of wine worth more than I made in months. And me? I was the unwanted extra in that show. At gatherings, Andrew made a point of introducing me to his banking colleagues as Mr. Collins, not my father, just another distant acquaintance, someone unimportant. At first, I swallowed hard, convincing myself it was just his way. But over time I realized it was deliberate. He wanted to erase every trace of my story. He didn't want anyone to associate the polished banker with a simple carpenter, with calloused hands and a worn coat, every detail cut deep. When he spoke about the house, he said, "It was a great investment of ours," never once mentioning that I had built those walls myself. When someone praised his determination, he answered, "I taught myself," as if I had never spent nights at the kitchen table teaching him how to add up bills under the dim light of a single lamp. And when Victoria laughed at my simple stories, I could see in her eyes that to her I was nothing but an embarrassment. It was as if I were being erased from the history of the very family I helped build. But I kept going. I kept showing up. Because deep down, I still had hope. Hope that one day Andrew would remember. That the little boy who once ran through the yard with a wooden toy car I built still lived somewhere inside him. But each visit proved the opposite. With every toast, every conversation, every look from Victoria, I was reminded that I was nothing more than an intruder in a world I myself had helped raise. The neighborhood, the wide streets, the imported cars parked in front of the neighbors' houses, all of it formed the perfect backdrop for me to be diminished. Because their status was everything, and for them, I had none. And it was in that contrast, between the carpenter who built and the banker who inherited without acknowledging, that the conflict began to grow stronger. I already felt that something bigger was coming, and deep down, I knew that world of appearances would eventually collapse. Sometimes I wonder if Andrew really remembers. If, somewhere in his memory, there's still the image of a man covered in dust, coming home late at night, with cut-up hands but a proud smile because he had made it through another day of work. Because that was my life. A life built with hammers, saws, and sweat. I never had a diploma hanging on the wall. My university was the hard ground of every job site I ever worked. And even so, I raised houses that still stand in this city today. Houses where entire families built their stories, where kids grew up running through the hallways I once helped paint. And it wasn't any different with Andrew. The house he lives in today, the one he flaunts as a symbol of status, was born from my hands. I remember when he was a teenager and dreamed of having his own room. I couldn't afford to hire anyone, so I took on the project myself. I spent weeks raising walls, reinforcing beams, fitting windows. Andrew, curious, would come to help, holding the flashlight while I sawed wood late into the night. I used to tell him, "Pay attention, son. This isn't just wood. It's discipline. It's patience. This is how you build something that lasts." He laughed, said this wasn't for him, that one day he didn't want to work with heavy things. But even so, he looked at me with a hint of respect. At least that's what I believed. With time, that respect disappeared. It was replaced with shame, but I never forgot. Because every corner of that house is a memory. The staircase railing, sanded smooth by my own hands. The fireplace, built stone by stone. The foundation, reinforced because I knew one day Andrew would have kids, and I wanted them to run across a floor strong enough to never give way. And yet, in the luxurious parties he hosted, there was never space for that story. When someone praised the house, Andrew would smile and say, "It was a great investment. I had vision at the right time." Vision, that's what he called it. As if vision alone could raise walls. As if vision poured cement or lifted beams in the middle of winter. It hurt. It hurt to see my work, my whole life, reduced to an empty word. It hurt to realize that to him, I wasn't the foundation. I was just a shadow. And it wasn't just about the house. It was about life. How many times had I walked miles in the rain because my truck had broken down, but I didn't want Andrew to miss school? How many times did I skip, buying myself new boots because he needed an expensive textbook for college? How many times did I swallow the shame of being treated as the simple guy, just so he could walk among those who thought they were great? All of that was erased, replaced by the narrative that he built everything on his own. But I knew the truth, and that truth burned inside me like hot iron. Because no silence erases the sound of a hammer. No arrogance erases the marks wood leaves on your hands. No lie erases the scars of someone who built the future of others with his own body. And still, I stayed quiet. Quiet at the parties. Quiet in the conversations. Quiet in the face of his indifference. Because I had learned one thing. A man who knows the value of what he's done doesn't need to shout. He just has to wait for the right moment. And my moment was coming. I didn't know exactly how or when, but I felt life would give me the chance to show it, to prove in front of everyone that this forgotten carpenter still had something to say, and this time, no one would silence me. It was a winter Saturday. Snow covered the sidewalks like a white carpet, and the cold air slipped through the seams of my worn-out coat. I arrived early at Andrew's house, or rather, the house I once dreamed of calling ours. Victoria was preparing an important dinner that night. She said strategic guests would be coming, influential people from the bank, business leaders from the city. I wasn't supposed to be there, but Andrew had called me earlier, with that dry voice, like a man carrying out an obligation. "Dad, come by a little early. We need to talk." The word need struck me as strange. I knew that when he used that tone, it wasn't an invitation. It was a summons. I entered through the back door, as always. Victoria crossed the hallway, dressed elegantly, still wearing a white apron over her gown. She didn't greet me, just looked me up and down quickly and said, in a neutral tone, "Andrew's in the office." The office. A room I had ironically expanded myself years earlier, when Andrew said he wanted a space to study. Now it was a temple of power. Dark wood-paneled walls, shelves packed with finance books he probably never read cover to cover, and a massive desk where contracts and papers were laid out like trophies. Andrew sat behind it, adjusting his tie in the mirror. He didn't offer me a chair. He just said, "Dad, here's the thing. Tonight, I don't want you talking much during dinner." I frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" He sighed, like a parent tired of explaining something to a child. "I don't want you telling those stories about construction, about wood, about building the house. These people don't need to hear that. It'll look bad for me." The words cut through me like ice. I breathed deeply, trying to stay calm. "Andrew, you know all of this exists because I once raised these walls. This is our story." He laughed, not a light laugh, a laugh full of disdain. "Our story? Dad, nobody here cares about that. What matters is who I am today. And you? Well, you've already played your part. Now you just need to stay out of the way." The words echoed in my mind. "You've already played your part," as if I were an old piece of furniture, shoved in a corner, once useful, now just taking up space. I tried to reply, but the door suddenly opened. Victoria walked in, checking her watch. "Richard, could you help bring some boxes of wine from the garage? At least you'll be useful. At least. I wasn't a father. I wasn't a builder. I wasn't a guest. I was just useful." I carried the boxes in silence. Their weight felt light compared to what I was carrying inside. Later, the dinner began. The room was full of men in suits and women in glittering dresses. Laughter echoed, glasses clinked. I stayed in a corner as always. At one point, one of the bankers, a gray-haired man with the voice of someone used to giving orders, asked, "Andrew, this is a beautiful house. Who designed it? Who built it?" It was my chance. My chest swelled, ready to hear my son say my name. Just a moment of recognition, a sliver of gratitude. But Andrew only smiled, raising his glass. "It was a great investment we made. I had the vision to hire the right people." Laughter followed, and a toast was made, and I, sitting there, was erased once again. But in that moment, something shifted inside me. It wasn't just pain. It wasn't just shame. It was something else, a silent decision. I realized that Andrew wasn't just denying me. He was rewriting history, turning the sweat of my hands into his so-called vision. And if I let it slide, one day even my grandchildren might never know the truth. The dinner went on, but I didn't hear a thing. Every laugh, every toast, every glance from Victoria felt like hot iron pressed against my skin. And in the middle of all that luxury, one certainty was born. I would not be erased. Not there. Not by him. And even if I had to wait, I would prove it. After that night, things only got worse. It wasn't one single blow. It was a series of tiny cuts, almost invisible, but together they left me raw. Andrew never confronted me directly. He didn't shout. He didn't throw me out. He erased me little by little. A look, a word, a choice. That was what killed me. The indifference. Whenever I went to his house, I was no longer welcomed as a father. Victoria treated me like an inconvenient guest. Her smile never reached her eyes. And Andrew seemed determined to keep me in the background. I remember one summer Sunday. I had prepared a gift for the grandkids, a wooden rocking horse, carved by hand with all the care in the world. I had spent weeks sanding, polishing, painting. I wanted them to have something of me, something that carried the story of their carpenter grandfather. I arrived early, carrying the toy wrapped in cloth. The boys ran toward me, excited. But before I could hand it over, Victoria stepped in. "Richard, that wasn't necessary. These things just take up space. They already have plenty of toys." She pulled the kids by the arm, handed them to Andrew, and left the package aside. like it was trash. My heart broke. I saw the boys' curious eyes, their eagerness to play, but their mother's word was final. The rocking horse sat forgotten in the corner, and I, once again too. A few days later, I had to go to the bank to fix a problem with my account. It was a busy Tuesday. When I reached the counter, Andrew was there, flawless suit, talking with important clients. I stepped forward and smiled, waiting for a, "Hi, Dad." He looked at me, and with the coldness of a stranger, he said, "Good morning, Mr. Collins. What can I do for you, Mr. Collins?" Not Dad, not Father, Mr. The client smiled, noticing nothing strange. To them, I was just another customer being helped by the branch manager. But to me, it was a knife to the chest. I wanted to answer, to shout, "I am your father!" But I didn't. I swallowed hard, signed the papers, and walked out in silence. And that wasn't the only time. Every visit to that house reminded me I wasn't welcome. In the dining room hung framed diplomas, photos of European trips, glamorous parties. Not a single old picture of us together. Not one record of the past that included me. One Christmas, I brought a box of ornaments I had made years earlier. Wooden stars, hand-painted, some with Andrew's name written on them when he was just a boy. I thought it would be a touching gesture, a way to revive old memories. Victoria looked, gave a forced smile, and said, "Oh, but we hired a decorator this year. They don't really match the theme of the tree." The ornaments stayed in the box, and I, once again, invisible. They were small things, but each one reminded me that to them, I was nothing more than an inconvenient shadow. The cruelest part was that there were always witnesses, guests, neighbors, clients at the bank, people who saw and believed Andrew's version, the successful self-made manager with a story of his own. And me? I was just the quiet old man in the corner. Every muffled laugh, every superior glance from Victoria, every Mr. Collins in public was another brick in the wall Andrew was building between us. And there I stood, on the other side, watching. The father who built with his hands, the man erased by his own son. But silently, I had already begun to plan, because every wall, no matter how tall, has cracks, and theirs was about to crumble. After so many small wounds, I learned to stay silent. But silence wasn't surrender. It was preparation. Andrew thought reducing me to a quiet spectator was victory. He didn't realize that while he erased me, I observed. While he called me a burden, I calculated. While he denied me in front of others, I gathered proof. And in that silence, the turnaround began to take shape. I started revisiting old boxes in the attic of my small house. Boxes filled with yellowed papers, receipts for building materials, old photographs of the houses I had worked on. Among them, I found the deed to Andrew's house. The paper, worn with time, bore one name in bold, mine, Richard Collins. The house where Andrew and Victoria flaunted their luxury was still legally tied to me. I had never formally transferred the deed. Years ago, when I finished construction, Andrew was too young, and I thought I had plenty of time. Later, I simply didn't worry about it. To me, a house was a symbol of family, not possession. But in that moment, it became a weapon. I spent sleepless nights going over documents. Every receipt Andrew ignored, every contract Victoria would never understand, I organized into a black folder. And the more I flipped through those pages, the more I realized my work had not been erased. It was there, recorded, and now it would be my defense. I didn't tell anyone, not even my old friend Thomas Reed, a retired lawyer I sometimes had coffee with, until one day I couldn't hold it in. I told him part of the story. "Thomas, my son treats me like a stranger, and I don't know if I should stay silent anymore." He took off his glasses, looked me in the eye, and said, "Richard, you've always been a fair man. But fairness doesn't mean blindness. If he treats you like a stranger, maybe it's time to remind him that even strangers have limits." It was the first spark of courage I received from someone else. Meanwhile, I kept visiting Andrew and Victoria. I kept hearing the digs, the muffled laughs, the disdainful looks. But every time they diminished me, I smiled quietly inside, because I knew something they didn't. History was still on my side. I began recording details. I saved Andrew's cold messages, where he spoke to me like a client. I noted down the dates Victoria rejected my gifts to the grandkids. It wasn't bitterness. It was preparation, like gathering wood for a fire that hasn't yet been lit. I remember one afternoon when Andrew once again called me Mr. Collins at the bank. I walked out with my head held high. Inside, I thought, "You have no idea, Andrew. The same Mr. Collins you despise is the owner of the roof over your family's head." And it was in that contrast that I found strength. I also started taking care of myself. I replaced my worn-out coat with a new one, still simple but clean and sharp. I cut my hair,
trimmed my beard. I wanted to be ready for the day when I would know.
Longer be the silenced father, but the man who spoke again, and this time, would be heard. Every night, alone in my quiet house, I repeated to myself, be patient, the right time will come, and when it comes, no one will be laughing. And that time, I could feel it getting closer. A man can be called a burden. He can be treated like a shadow, ignored at parties and erased in speeches. But a builder never forgets the walls he raised, and a father never forgets the value of what he gave. All I had to do was wait, and waiting was something I had learned to do very well. I knew the time had come, not because I forced it, but because life itself arranged the pieces on the board. It was a cold February morning. The wind slammed against the glass windows of the bank where Andrew worked. I walked slowly to the revolving door, carrying my black folder under my arm, the same folder where I had kept every document, every piece of proof, every trace of what I had truly built. It wasn't anger I felt. It was something greater, a strange calm, the kind you feel when you know you have nothing left to lose. Inside the branch, the atmosphere was another world. Men and women rushed past, heels and shoes clicking sharply on the polished floor, hushed voices blending with the metallic hum of computers. At the far end, I saw Andrew behind his manager's desk, blue tie, rehearsed smile, surrounded by important clients. I took a deep breath and stepped forward. Mr. Collins, the receptionist, greeted me. Used to seeing me there as just another customer. I smiled. That day, the title, Mr., would carry a very different weight. Andrew looked up, saw me, and tried to hide his discomfort. Mr. Collins, what are you doing here? The slip in his words drew curious glances from nearby clients. I didn't answer right away. I walked to his desk, pulled out a chair, and sat down. My black folder rested on the glossy wood. I didn't come here for bank business today, Andrew. I came to talk about something else. He cleared his throat, clearly uneasy. Maybe we could talk in private. In my office? I shook my head. No, today we'll talk right here, where everyone can hear. Silence fell like a weight. The nearby clients, pretending to fill out forms, were now listening closely. Employees whispered to each other. Victoria, who had entered moments earlier to drop off some papers, froze in the hallway. I opened the folder slowly, like reopening an old wound. I pulled out the first document, the deed to the house. I held it up for everyone to see. This house you love to show off, Andrew. Every brick, every beam, every piece of wood was placed there by me. But what few people know is that it's still in my name. It was never transferred, because I believed it didn't need to be. I believed family didn't need documents to recognize itself. A murmur rippled through the room. Andrew turned pale. He tried to stand, but his voice faltered. Dad, this isn't the place for... I cut him off, firm. Don't call me Dad here. You're the one who chose to call me Mr. Collins, so that's who I'll be. But today, everyone will hear who this Mr. really is, the man you've been trying so hard to erase. I laid out old photos, me as a young man covered in dust, smiling in front of the unfinished frame of the house, my calloused arms holding little Andrew, laughing proudly as he sat on a pile of planks. This is the real story of that house, and the real story of your life. You didn't build it alone. You didn't start from nothing. You were carried by the same arms you now reject. The looks around the branch were stunned. Clients glanced at each other. Employees stopped typing. Victoria brought her hand to her mouth, unable to hide her shock. Andrew, flushed red, tried to recover. This is ridiculous. You didn't have to expose this. I leaned forward, steady, locking eyes with him. Ridiculous is a son denying the blood in his veins. Ridiculous is erasing his own father's history to protect a fake status. Today, Andrew, it's not just you who will hear this. Everyone here will know who really laid the foundation of your life. Then, I slammed the folder shut. The sound echoed through the bank lobby like the gavel of a judge. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear only the clock on the wall and the heavy breathing of the crowd. Andrew didn't answer. He couldn't. His flawless manager's image was shattered right there in front of everyone. Not because I shouted, but because I showed. Because the proof was in my hands. Undeniable. I stood slowly, straightened my coat, and looked around. Some clients stared with respect. Others lowered their heads, embarrassed, but all of them understood. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. I walked out of that branch without hurry, leaving behind the son who, that day, finally tasted the bitter reality of treating me like a stranger. And that was only the beginning. The lobby still hung in that strange, suffocating silence. I could hear the scrape of a chair, the nervous cough of an employee not sure whether to keep working or keep watching. Andrew stood there, hands on the desk, face red, eyes darting away from mine. It was the first time I had ever seen him speechless. The son who always had a comeback, who always spoke louder to cover me, now shrank before the father he had disowned. I lifted the deed once more, raised it above my head, and let it fall onto the desk with a heavy thud. The sound echoed like a hammer, delivering the final verdict. You treated me like a stranger, Andrew. My voice was steady, without tremor, without doubt. So from this day forward, I'll treat you like one too. The house you live in was never yours. Never theirs. It is mine. I built it, I registered it, and now, in front of everyone, I take it back. The shock spread like electricity. A client gasped, "My God." Another shook his head in disbelief. Employees exchanged glances, some nearly smirking with nervousness. Victoria stepped forward, her heels clicking against the marble floor, but she froze mid-step. Her face went pale, her eyes wide. It was as if the entire stage of status and appearances she clung to had just cracked beneath her feet. Andrew tried to react. "You can't do this! You can't just—" I raised my hand to cut him off. "Yes, I can. I can because this isn't just law. It's justice. You wanted to call me Mr. Collins? Then that's who I'll be. Not your father in the eyes of others. Just the man who gave you everything you never acknowledged, and now takes it back." The words hung heavy in the air, and then I said the phrase I had kept sharpened like a blade, waiting for the perfect moment to cut. "You can deny my blood, but you will never erase my hands." A collective shiver ran through the room. Someone let out a loud sigh. Another whispered a low, "Wow." It was as if every single person there suddenly understood the weight of all those years of silence, work, and injustice. Andrew leaned back in his chair, defeated, his eyes red, his chin trembling. The confident manager, the arrogant banker, crumbled in front of everyone. I rose slowly, straightened the new coat on my shoulders, and looked around at the room. Some nodded respectfully, others looked away in shame, but all of them knew. This wasn't just an old carpenter complaining. It was a father, reclaiming his dignity in front of them all. The atmosphere was so heavy it felt like time itself had stopped. Even the clock on the wall seemed to mark each second with extra weight. And me? I felt something I hadn't in years. Pride. Not the pride of winning, but the pride of not letting myself be erased. I turned my back on Andrew, left the folder on his desk, and walked toward the door. No one dared stop me. The sound of my footsteps echoed like victory drums in that hall that, minutes before, had been his territory. Now it was my stage. Before leaving, I turned one last time. I looked at Andrew, frozen in place, and said, "You chose to treat me like a stranger. Now you'll find out what it means to lose what you never valued." And then I walked out, leaving behind not just the bank, but years of silence, humiliation, and a weight that was never mine to carry. In that instant, I knew the turning point had come, and nothing, absolutely nothing, would ever be the same again. I left the bank like a man walking across a battlefield after victory. I didn't need to look back to know what I was leaving behind. The whispers, the stares, the murmurs had already begun the moment I closed the folder. Deep down, I knew nothing would ever be the same. Outside, the cold wind struck my face, but I didn't flinch. I walked down the street with my head high, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. Inside the bank, Andrew was still trapped in his own silence. Later, I heard that important clients whispered among themselves, questioning how a man willing to erase his own father could be trusted with other people's money. The respect he craved so desperately with speeches of success crumbled in minutes. Victoria didn't walk away unscathed either. Her proud posture collapsed. The judgment in her eyes was replaced with panic. The woman who had always treated me like an inconvenience now realized the luxury she flaunted had no solid foundation, because the foundation was mine, and I had just pulled it out from under her feet. The days that followed were devastating. Andrew tried to call me, but I didn't answer. Messages arrived on my phone, some cold, others almost desperate, but none of them contained the one word I had waited my whole life to hear: sorry. In the neighborhood, the news spread fast. People who once only saw me as old Richard now greeted me with respect. Some even remembered old stories. "Didn't you build my cousin's house?" Suddenly, the identity that had been forgotten resurfaced, not as a burden, but as a foundation. And for Andrew, every look became a judgment. At church, at the market, even at the bank, there was always someone who looked at him differently. He wanted to bury the episode, but how do you bury something witnessed by dozens of people? The hardest consequence, however, wasn't public. It was private. For the first time, Andrew had to face Victoria in silence. I heard their argument that night shook the walls of the house. She, furious, shouted that she couldn't stand living under her father-in-law's roof. He, with no answers, just paced in circles, because now, even inside his own home, the walls reminded him who had truly built them. And me? I didn't make a scene. I didn't chase headlines. I demanded nothing beyond what was already mine. I simply let the truth do what truth always does, expose. And exposing, sometimes, is crueler than punishing. Andrew lost what he valued most, his image of perfection. Victoria lost the foundation that held up her arrogance, and I gained something no one could ever take from me: respect. In that silence after the storm, I realized something simple. The world may try to erase your hands, but when those hands have built something real, sooner or later the truth will appear. And that day, it had appeared. Life never went back to the same after that day, and truthfully, I didn't want it to. For too long, I had carried the weight of invisibility. I walked bent, not from age, but from believing my worth depended on my son's recognition. When Andrew called me a burden, I almost believed it. But in that bank, in front of everyone, I realized I wasn't carrying anything. He was the one dragging his arrogance like a heavy chain. After the confrontation, I didn't go back to his house right away. I spent days walking the streets of the city, looking at the houses I had built. Every door, every window, every detail shaped by my hands. Families living inside, not even knowing that an anonymous carpenter had once dreamed for them. And for the first time in years, it didn't hurt. On the contrary, it filled me with pride, because I understood that the value of what we do doesn't depend on who recognizes it. The value is in what remains. And my hands, no matter how tired, had left marks that time could never erase. Andrew tried to approach me later. One rainy afternoon, he even knocked on my door. I heard his voice on the other side. "Dad, we need to talk. Things are hard." But I didn't open, not out of bitterness, but because I understood. It wasn't the moment. He needed to feel the emptiness he had created, to walk alone through the silence he had forced me to carry for years. Sometimes closing the door is the only way to teach, and that's what I did. My life began to change in unexpected ways. People in town started reaching out, wanting to hear old stories. A local newspaper asked to publish a piece about the carpenter who built half the neighborhood. I turned down interviews. I didn't need a stage anymore. My stage had already been that day at the bank, and that was enough. I started dedicating more time to myself. I renovated my small workshop. I went back to working with wood, not to sell, not to prove anything, but simply to remember who I was. The smell of sawdust, the rhythmic sound of the hammer. Each gesture was a silent prayer. I realized the turning point hadn't been just against Andrew. It was against every look that had once diminished me, against every time I'd been called old, a burden, a nobody, against all the complicit silences that pretended not to see the injustice. And above all, it was for me. I had reclaimed myself. Today, when I think of that moment at the bank, I don't see revenge. I see freedom, because I finally understood. Dignity isn't something others give you. It's something you decide never to lose. And maybe that's why I'm telling you this story now, because I know you. Watching this may have felt invisible before. Maybe you've been belittled by your own family. Maybe you felt your effort erased, like it never mattered. But let me tell you, don't believe that lie. No one has the right to define your worth. No one has the power to erase the marks you've left in this world. Whether in your work, in your family, or even in the smallest gestures, everything you've built is part of who you are, and that no one can steal. If you've made it this far, I want to ask you for something. Share in the comments if anyone has ever tried to erase your story, if you've ever been called a burden, or if you've ever been made to feel invisible. Your voice matters. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because every time we share stories like this, we prove, together, that dignity has no age, no price, and can't be bought in any bank. Because in the end, my greatest victory wasn't taking my son's house away. It was reclaiming my own, the house inside me, the one no one will ever tear down again.